Hello, my name is Anneke Stasson, and my paper is called Historians on Gospel Women, the Female Part in Anglo-American Evangelical Foreign Missions. How have evangelical historians remembered women missionaries? In this essay, we will look first at 19th century biographers as they set the stage for later historiography. Not surprisingly, we will see that each era's characterization of missionaries tells us something about what that era values. 19th century evangelical biographers made self-sacrifice central to their characterization of missionary women. By contrast, late 20th century feminist historians made self-actualization central. Different eyes looking at the history have enabled us to see the overlapping and sometimes contradicting facets of missionary identity. As I would tell my students, one set of eyes is never enough to grasp the truth of history. Part 1. 19th century evangelical missionary memoirs. I grew up devouring stories of missionary heroes, and it was no different in the 19th century evangelical Protestant world. Missionaries were and are the saints of the Protestant world. We Protestants don't typically look up to monks and nuns, nor do we read their hagiographies. However, we crowd to churches when missionaries are home on furlough, and we teach our children about the bravery and sacrifice of Jim and Elizabeth Elliot. In the early 19th century, Harriet Newell was the one everyone read about. She died in 1812 before being able to live out her first year as a missionary, and yet, through the memoir of her life, written by her husband, Newell's example of self-sacrifice stimulated many others to give themselves to mission, or to contribute financially to the mission cause. Memoirs like Newell's were, according to Claire Midgley, frequently published in a number of editions of several thousand copies each. They weren't written by the missionary wife herself, generally. They were written after her death by her husband or some other individual. Within these memoirs, one finds a common set of tropes. First, there's the trope of the sacrificial woman, exemplified by Harriet Newell herself. Even women who died young, like Newell, were quoted as saying, prior to their death, that they didn't regret becoming a missionary, even if they died within their first year. In Christina Coillard's biography, written by her niece, husband Francois says, "When the call of God made itself clearly heard, Christina immediately, without hesitation, without consulting flesh and blood, sacrificed everything." Memoirs depicted women as being willing to forsake all the comforts of home in order to follow God's call. Anna Hinderer's biographer said of her that her faith never failed, nor even wavered in the dark and tedious hours of trial. For Christ's sake and in his service, she left comfort, security, and an eminently useful and happy sphere of duty at home for peril, fatigue, privation, and special risk of death. The sense in the 19th century was that self-sacrifice and compassion were particularly female virtues. A missionary promoter wrote that women possess a tenderness of feeling, a depth of compassion, a quickness of perception, and a forgetfulness of self, more than do men. Next, the trope of the supportive wife. The mission theorists of the early 19th century believed that it was not good for the man to be alone. William Carey, generally regarded as the founder of the Protestant missionary movement, said that married men were the ideal missionaries. In order to prevent their time from being employed in procuring necessities, these men's wives should go with them to the field, and should be wholly employed in providing for them. Carey did not see wives as missionaries in their own right. By taking care of the home and children, wives freed husbands for mission work. The early memoirs of missionary wives affirmed their supportive role. Mary Moffat's son John said of his mother, "Her first duty was to take care of husband, and she would reprimand other wives if they didn't do it." Moffat remembered his mother saying that while she did not take a prominent part in direct missionary work, it was her satisfaction to provide for the temporal wants of a servant of Christ who was doing the work. And she felt what was true, that he, Robert, never would have been the missionary he was but for her care for him. Anna Hinderer's biographer also dogmatically affirmed her supportive role. Although, quote, Mrs. Hinderer necessarily fills nearly the whole space in the following memorials, an observant eye will perceive that she was always engaged in her own proper sphere. Mr. Hinderer was the Lord's chief instrument for gathering disciples. Christina Coillard's biographer said of her that she was overflowing with kindness and hospitality, utterly devoted to her husband and his work. Lucy Thurston said in her memoir, I approve the motto that the missionary best serves his generation who serves the public, and his wife best serves her generation who serves her family. Bessie Price reflected in her journal that the real work of the missionary wife was to keep her husband's spirits up so that he didn't get discouraged. We wives act as organ blowers to the musicians, she said. The next trope is the loving mother. Biographers also celebrated women as mothers, and women like Hinderer and Coillard, who were unable to have biological children, were celebrated for adopting children on the mission field. The children in Ibadan called Hinderer Iya, mother, and she wrote in her diary, I can never stir without a flock around me. In 1860, she had 20 children living with her. Even single women, once they began going to the field, followed the tradition of adopting local children. Think of the famous picture of Mary Slessor, surrounded by 4 of her adopted African children, dressed neatly in black frocks with white aprons. Slessor's care for the people earned her the name Everybody's Mother. The industrious housewife was another important trope in missionary literature. David Livingstone is credited with having said, a pioneer missionary was a jack of all trades without, and his wife a maid of all work within. The wife's ability to make a foreign, inhospitable place feel like home was a constant refrain in the missionary literature. One of the wife's most essential roles was providing food for her household. In the mission context, this was no easy task, as it involved gathering wood for a fire and hauling water, often from quite a distance. Missionary wives hired people to help, but the organization and overseeing of food production fell on their shoulders. Probably more than any other task, providing food led to the strain of missionary wives. Francois Coillard remarked of his wife, my poor wife is always ill and can bear the strain no longer. She has 53 mouths to feed every day. Adele Mabille at one point had over 100 people to provide for, between students, children, and servants. During war times, providing for one's household became even more difficult. Missionary wives had to find a way to stretch their meager resources to feed the growing numbers of the homeless, hungry, and sick around them. 19th century biographers described women as, above all, sacrificial, maternal housewives, content to be doing the supportive, not the primary work of missions. Is this really who these women were? Or is this simply what 19th century biographers valued? Lucky for us, many others have commented on the female part in Anglo-American missions, and their perspective helps us glean a more well-rounded understanding of missionaries. Part 2, Evangelical Reports on Mission. After about 100 years of the Protestant missionary movement, individuals and groups began producing large-scale reports about what missionaries were accomplishing throughout the world. Because of time, I will mention only 2 of these reports. In 1897, Presbyterian former missionary James Dennis produced the first of his 3 volumes on Christian missions and social progress. Dennis was an outspoken advocate of missions and described Christianity as a supreme force in the social regeneration and elevation of the human race. Consistent with what Dana Robert calls the chauvinism of missions at the height of Western imperialism, Dennis's text unabashedly portrays the superiority of Western culture and the Christian religion. He does not describe many missionaries, women missionaries, by name, But their work lies in the background of much that Dennis finds so commendable: education, medical care, orphanages, homes for lepers, raising the legal age of marriage, and ending sati and foot binding. In all of these ways, he says, women uplift or save their non-Western sisters. Dennis is quick to celebrate missions generally, but he lacks the kind of sophisticated gender analysis that later scholars would come to employ. He does note that women have come to outnumber men on the mission field, and not a single one of these women is featured on the page of photos inside the front cover. He mentions that some missionary societies still oppose the sending of single women to the field, and it's clear that he disagrees with these societies. But he does not seem concerned to root out gender bias in the mission organizations, something that later scholars will certainly attend to. In 1910, Helen Barrett Montgomery, who would go on to become the first woman president of the Northern Baptist Convention, wrote Western Women in Eastern Lands. This book celebrated 50 years of the women's missionary movement. We've seen how 19th century missionary memoirs emphasized the supportive nature of women's work. Montgomery emphasized women as pioneers. First, she says, women pioneered new forms of literature. Instead of publishing mission material in denominational reports as men had done, women prepared short pamphlets which they could sell for a few cents each in order to raise money and spread the word about missions. They were hugely successful in this venture and forever changed the shape of mission advertising. Second, women founded the first schools for girls in many countries throughout Asia and Africa. Montgomery shows how women's persistence and creativity overcame myriad obstacles to women's education within various cultural settings. Montgomery celebrates the women who graduated from mission schools and went on to become the first female doctors, nurses, educators, and social workers in their countries. Third, missionaries were innovative in developing a way to reach the secluded upper-class women of India and China. They termed their innovation Zenana missions. The idea was that missionaries would visit secluded women in their homes, this being the only culturally appropriate way to get the gospel and education and new forms of hygiene, etc., to secluded women. Men couldn't share the gospel with these women, only other women could. And not just any women. They had to be single women, since married women kept saying they didn't have enough time. Which brings up another innovation: the decision to send single women to the field. In the mid-19th century, the missionary establishment was largely opposed to sending single women. So, women took it upon themselves to found missionary societies. In England, the Female Education Society sent out 90 missionaries between 1834 and 1860. But in the US, it wasn't until after the Civil War that women's societies began to send single missionaries. Fourth, women were pioneers in developing a whole corps of women evangelists, whom they termed Bible women. Montgomery says this innovation began very naturally in the desire of converted women to tell their neighbors and friends the glad tidings. Soon, missionaries established training schools to prepare evangelists for their work. By 1910, there were 5,700 Bible women on the books, officially working as paid evangelists. By comparison, there were only 380 Western women evangelists in the field in 1910. Allow me to point out my word choice here. I've chosen to call them evangelists because that is what they were. But the formal term in the 19th century was Bible woman, just like the first evangelists of the Women's Foreign Missionary Society were called Zenana workers, and the first British women missionaries were called female agents. These linguistic choices perhaps shielded women from criticism. Fifth, missionaries were the first female medical doctors in Asia and Africa. They developed the first hospitals for women and children. and medical schools for women. As Montgomery tells this history, she reveals that here, as in all the other realms discussed, women had to face opposition from men. But, quote, with God and nature leading them, the women pioneers pressed out into the untried path. Hundreds of more timid souls followed them, and the protesting old world settled back, grumbling, to get used to the new situation. A sixth innovation that Montgomery hints at is the ecumenism of the women's missionary movement. These women cared far more about the uplift of non-Western women than about intra-denominational disputes. That women were ecumenical pioneers is a point Pierce Beaver made a big deal about in 1968, saying that the ecumenical movement did not begin with Edinburgh 1910, but with the women's missionary movement. Women were also pioneers in the preparation of textbooks for the interdenominational study of missions. Montgomery's own text, Western Women in Eastern Lands, was part of this study series, but it began 10 years earlier in 1900. Dana Roberts says this study series was the most popular and successful ecumenical mission publication series in American history. Women were pioneers. It is indisputable. How has this still not become common knowledge? I wish more people today would sit down and read Montgomery's text, as so many people did back in 1910. Her text makes it clear that women missionaries made important, innovative developments in literature, education, medicine, evangelism, paid employment for women, and ecumenism. So, which vision of women is more accurate? The 19th century biographer's vision of missionaries as sacrificial, supportive, maternal housewives? Or Montgomery's vision of missionaries as innovative pioneers who had to lean on God and nature to get through difficult male opposition? Lucky for us, women missionaries have actually become a fruitful field of study for modern historians, particularly those interested in female culture and the history of empire. Their work gives us even more food for thought. Part 3, Academic Historiography on Women Missionaries. Part 1, the first feminists. In 1968, missiologist and former missionary R. Pierce Beaver produced the first academic history of American women in mission. He argued that from the Civil War to the 1920s, it was chiefly women who enlisted the forces of the church in world mission. Like Montgomery, Beaver also highlighted the misogyny bound up with modern missions. First, he noted that missionary wives were kept subordinate to men. Although the wife was considered indispensable, she got little official recognition. It was her husband who was appointed missionary. Second, when women began forming missionary societies, they were, quote, delayed in organization, hampered in action, and restricted in developing programs because of the long-lingering opposition of men to the public appearance and action of women. Beaver concluded, quote, the church has always been the bastion of male arrogance and power, and the men were most reluctant to share control and ministry with the women, end quote. Third, Beaver traced the tragic reintegration of women's societies into the male-led boards. When women lost their capacity to direct their own work, they also lost the motivation to do so. Beaver tied this to Max Warren's voluntary principle. You need people to take their own initiative if you want the work to get done. You have to give them agency. You have to free them from your control. This stimulates creativity and drive. So, when men took away women's authority, the whole mission movement lost out as well. Ultimately, Beaver noted that even though women had to deal with opposition from men, overseas mission still gave women opportunities for ministry that weren't available back home. In 1980, Beaver produced a revised edition of his text, in which he called the women's missionary movement, quote, the first feminist movement in North America. He claimed that it stimulated the rise of various other streams in the 19th century struggle for women's rights and freedom, though he did not make those connections explicit. 4 years later, in 1984, feminist historian Jane Hunter argued that, quote, female missionary organizations were not self-consciously feminist, and in fact were among the more conservative women's organizations at the turn of the century. In a 1988 book on women missionaries, Christian historian Ruth Tucker agreed. Missionary women, said Tucker, generally acknowledged the leadership of the male sex with little complaint, and in some cases they strongly protested any suggestion that they might be feminists. So both of these women were disagreeing with Beaver's description of missionary women as feminists. However, Tucker did acknowledge that women missionaries had a strong proclivity for independence, and several of them did protest their lack of salary and voting rights. Reading Tucker, Hunter, and Beaver side by side makes me ask the question, what do they mean by feminist? Hunter is surely right to say that missionaries didn't consider themselves feminists. They thought of suffragettes as feminists. More than gaining the vote, missionaries cared about uplifting women and girls around the world through the spread of Christianity. And yet, as Shirley Garrett pointed out in 1982, the goals of the women's missionary movement were defined in the language of feminism. Missionaries wanted to see the world's women liberated from injustices like child marriage, forced prostitution, and foot binding. And interestingly, in their own way, missionaries themselves longed for liberation. In her book on missionaries in China, Hunter argues that they, quote, extolled the virtues of the evangelical women's sphere at the same time that their lives were celebrating their surprising and abundant liberation from its bonds. Even though missionaries claimed to be self-sacrificing, they often went to China looking for deeper meaning and purpose. They wanted to be able to make something more of their lives than what was available to them back home. And yet these women had to, quote, clothe their ambition in a garb which did no violence to their sense of feminine Christian virtue. Some of the same women who showed up in Montgomery's 1910 text show up again in Hunter's 1984 text. Women like Eliza Agnew and Fidelia Fisk. In Montgomery's work, these women were pioneers, and they continue to be depicted as such in Hunter's text. But Hunter's text also incorporates these women's extraordinary ambition in a way that is absent from Montgomery's text. Ambition and thwarted ambition was also a central theme of Patricia Grimshaw's 1989 study of missionary wives in Hawaii. Like Hunter, she says women's presence in the foreign mission service was part of a separate female ambition for an important and independent career. And like Hunter, she talks about how motherhood thwarted this ambition. Mothers were so concerned to protect their children from undesirable Chinese and Hawaiian influences, to recreate America around their children, and to be the best mom and wife they could be, that they simply didn't have the emotional energy to pour into evangelism or teaching. They felt depressed about having to sacrifice mission for maternity, but they also felt that this was the sacrifice God was asking them to make. Indeed, sacrifice was the theological motif that enabled them to deal with their own frustration at having to give up mission work. Ultimately, even though Hunter and Grimshaw didn't classify missionaries as feminists per se, they did show that mission broadened the possibilities for women's lives, and this liberation was exactly what some women were looking for. In the 1990s, scholars began to argue that the liberation of missionary women came at the expense of non-Western women in colonized lands. The entire women's missionary movement was built on the idea that non-Western women needed to be rescued from patriarchal religions and cultures that denied them basic rights. By swooping in with education, medical care, and the gospel, missionary women saw themselves as the saviors of their heathen sisters. You will remember that in the early 20th century, this woman savior idea was praised by people like James Dennis. Missionaries were seen as heroes for uplifting women around the world. However, during the 1980s, says Eliza Kent, there was a, quote, self-critical turn in women's studies. The ethnocentricity of white feminism's claim to speak for all women came under sharp critique. Studies from scholars who were shaped by this self-critical turn and by post-colonial scholarship more generally depicted missionaries in an altogether different way from how people like Montgomery and Dennis had depicted them back in the early 20th century. Instead of simply acknowledging that, yes, missionaries were entangled in the baggage of empire, scholars like John and Jean Komroff began arguing that missionaries were the most active cultural agents of empire. More than traders or politicians, missionaries were the ones on the ground seeking to change modes of production, gender relations, dress, architecture, and the understanding of time. If the Swana people in South Africa wanted to convert to Christianity, the Komroffs showed how these people were expected to work like Europeans, dress like Europeans, and change their one-roomed huts into square, many-roomed homes. One strategy for saving young women was to relocate them to mission boarding schools, where, in addition to the 3 R's, they would learn how to keep house according to Western standards. It's jarring to see the same missionaries who were lauded as heroes in 19th century texts show up in post-colonial scholarship as villains. But the change in viewpoint triggers this alternate assessment. During the 1990s, scholars increasingly told the missionary story from the side of those who had been colonized. Missionaries were then depicted as the worst of colonialists because they so fiercely wanted to change the behavior and practices of the people, to remake them into images of civilized Westerners. As Eliza Kent says, Christian women cast their clients in the role of inferiors who needed to change, sometimes to the extent of characterizing them as beasts. Because of their emphasis on the quotidian, the life of the home, the raising of children, women missionaries have been called, quote, the most dedicated and the most successful emissaries of an entire civilization. Early missionary women in China, Hawaii, and India did not witness many conversions, but they were hugely successful in conveying the pattern of Western domesticity. And yet, missionaries were definitely not the only side of the story. That's why I like Eliza Kent's description of missionaries as instigators for new fashions. The missionaries were there, pushing their own preferred ways of living. But in Kent's telling of the story, it is the Indian women themselves who are center stage. They adopt a discourse of respectability, which draws both from Victorian and upper-class Hindu ideologies of womanhood, in order to assert their own new social and moral status as followers of Christ. This is in the way that she's looking at some of the women from a lower class that took on this discourse of respectability. Deborah Gateskill, who we'll hear from shortly, has written about this same dynamic in South Africa. She wrote in 1983 that, quote, the ideology of domesticity was not simply a missionary imposition, alien to the needs of Black Christians. It embodied meaningful values which frequently resonated both with the pre-Christian family role of African women and their post-industrial daily experiences. In a later article, Gateskill argued that late 19th century missionary teachers did see themselves as part of the imperial project and worked to inculcate imperial loyalty in their students. But starting in the 1920s, quote, Christianity and African identity began to outstrip imperialism and Britishness as dominant values in the socialization and education of African schoolgirls. And in yet another article, Gaitskell described how female mission strategies shifted from the inculcation of devout domesticity to other priorities during the first half of the 20th century. When it comes to unpacking female mission strategies, the work of my mentor, historian Dana Robert, has been invaluable. In her now classic book, American Women in Mission, Robert argues that women went abroad not only as doers, but as thinkers. They had particular theologies to share. They took risks and developed gender-based mission theories. They, quote, pioneered new forms of mission, ranging from medical work to training Bible women to accompanying the poor. And in the 20th century, they pioneered the missiology of world friendship. Two of Robert's points in American Women in Mission seem to me the most salient. The first is that although most women didn't write theological treatises, they most emphatically were missiologists. Second, the mission theory they developed was holistic. For women, spreading the gospel was intimately bound up with starting schools and hospitals. Salvation entailed liberation not only from faulty religious systems, but also from ignorance and illness. Missionaries were among the best educated women of their time, and they believed that the education of women was key to elevating women's role in society. As a student of Dr. Robert, I always appreciated the way that she highlighted women's good work while also giving us a nuanced understanding of the morally complex nature of holistic mission. She showed us how the first schools for girls in many parts of the world were started by missionaries, and for that, women around the world have expressed gratitude. But she also taught that, quote, holistic mission at its worst ran the danger of cultural imperialism, of imposing Western lifestyles and values to the destruction of indigenous ones. I have also appreciated and carried forward Robert's attention to the Christian home. She has argued that, quote, over the past 2 centuries, the missiology of the Christian home has functioned as a justification for the participation of women in mission, as a gender-based evangelistic strategy, and as a foundation on which to construct the liberation and leadership of women and society. Even if North Americans might consider it passé, the Christian home is still a viable and inspiring concept for women in the global church today. And need I remind you, I can hear her say, that women outnumber men approximately 2 to 1 in the global church. This has caused Dr. Robert to call world Christianity a women's movement, and to continue to insist that scholars keep gender as a category of analysis in our studies of global Christianity. Like Beaver, Gaitskell, Montgomery, and others, Robert has consistently documented the sad history of male opposition to female leadership in mission. She provides more historical context for the male takeover of the women's missionary societies, pointing out that women had, quote, worked themselves out of a job. They had successfully created a network of schools and hospitals for women around the world, and indigenous women had taken over leadership of these institutions. Plus, missionary women had shifted away from the gender-based thinking of woman's work for woman towards a more gender-neutral missiology of world friendship. Nevertheless, women missionaries fought the male takeover of their institutions in the early 20th century. They fought and they lost. All their organizations were absorbed into the male-led mission organizations. I remember when we studied this history in class. It was such an aha moment for me when Dr. Robert pointed out the tendency for women's work to get caught in the crossfire anytime there's a culture war between conservatives and liberals. So, in the early 20th century fundamentalist modernist controversy, conservatives began associating women's mission work with liberalism, and liberals began seeing women's gender-separate work as old-fashioned. Dr. Robert says the loss of common ground between conservatives and liberals eroded the holistic middle, thereby undercutting women's leadership in missions. According to Catherine Allen, a similar thing happened in the 1970s and 80s when conservatives took over the Southern Baptist Convention and enforced their opposition to women's leadership. Even though Baptist women had long had freedom and opportunity to serve as missionaries and as missions promoters, they were brought firmly under male control at the end of the 20th century. Robert argues that women have typically done mission work within a framework of service, healing, teaching, and hospitality. And yet, Robert has also shown us the outliers. People like the 19th century Baptist wives in Burma, who actually preached. The rugged terrain of Burma made itinerant evangelism a necessity for missionaries there, and the relatively egalitarian relationships between Burmese men and women made the ministry of women more broadly acceptable than among the sex-segregated cultures of India. That's a quote from American Women in Mission. The mission field makes all the difference in what women were expected and able to do. Same Bible, same desire to spread the gospel, same 19th century American childhood, but women missionaries in Burma preached and women missionaries in Hawaii kept house. Robert and others have written about Lottie Moon, the missionary in China who fought for her right to evangelize instead of doing the typical women's job of teaching. And as Tucker points out, since Moon was not ordained, it was imperative for her, more so than for her male counterparts, to train up indigenous ministers as soon as possible. So, within 2 decades, the Chinese pastor that Tucker had trained, that Lottie Moon had trained, had baptized more than 1,000 converts. In a similar vein, Bonnie Sue Lewis has written about 4 women missionaries among the Nez Perce who trained and empowered 18 native pastors between 1879 and 1927. And she makes the point that this is far more native pastors being trained up than if they would have been trained by male missionaries, because the female missionaries weren't ordained and so needed to train up ordained pastors. These women, says Bonnie Sue Lewis, and the male pastors were both disadvantaged in terms of their access to the power structures of the Presbyterian Church, and Lewis argues that the women and native men served to bolster each other's position in the church. Kevin Yao has shown how the work of 2 holiness women, Ruth Paxton and Grace Woods, impacted future male leaders of the Chinese church, Watchman Nee and Leland Long. The work of these women in the 1920s was, says Yao, unprecedented. Never before had women missionaries initiated and led massive revivals in China. These women commanded national and international attention equal to any male mission leader of the day. Yao explains that the women were able to have power because, quote, the spontaneous, individualistic, and interdenominational nature of revivals made it possible to bypass the established mission structures controlled by men. So all of these examples I've just shared from Tucker, Yao, and Robert show that even though much of the women's missionary work has taken place within the framework of women's work for women, not all of it has. Although women have typically engaged in service, healing, teaching, and hospitality, they have also at times served as preachers and as trainers of men. Modern scholars, both evangelical and non-evangelical, are interested in female agency. Women are actors in their own stories. They are not just acted upon. They have ideas and express them. They don't just submit to the ideas and actions of others. Women are leaders, not just followers. Lastly, as Rhonda Semple argues, single women missionaries who went to the field during the second half of the 19th century professionalized and validated the work that married women have been doing all along, work like teaching. Single women missionaries have often come across in feminist scholarship as the true heroes of the women's missionary movement. These women provided a way out for 19th century women stuck in the cult of domesticity. They gave women at home and abroad a new model of what women can be. As professional women who underwent a rigorous interview process and were then given a salary to do a job that required great fortitude, these women broke the glass ceiling of their day. And so we come to the end of this survey of the historiography of women missionaries, and we return to our questions. Were missionaries feminists? Were they agents of empire? Were they sacrificial, happy to play a supportive rather than a central role? Yes. And no. They didn't consider themselves feminists, but they most assuredly did advance new occupations for women. They didn't set out to challenge Victorian gender norms, but they most assuredly did challenge those norms through their running of missionary societies and through their various authoritative roles on the mission field. Missionary women often experienced a greater sense of agency, independence, and fulfillment than their peers in Europe and America. The early missionary wives saw themselves as playing a secondary supportive role. But later scholars have described women as driving the Protestant missionary movement and the spread of Western imperialism. Women were powerful agents of empire because they oversaw the domestic realm, where, as the Komarovs pointed out, quote, colonizers everywhere try to gain control over the practices through which would-be subjects produce and reproduce the basis of their existence. An example, when Lucy Thurston arrived in Hawaii in 1820, she was appalled at the nudity of the natives. 9 years later, she was running a women's group which consisted of 1,800 Hawaiian women. By Thurston's decree, these women had to be fully clothed in order to belong to the group. We can debate whether or not Thurston was right to insist Hawaiians wear clothing, but it's clear that through her women's group, she was shaping the colonial landscape in a pretty major way. In conclusion, women's central role in mission and empire building is undisputed in academic scholarship. So too is the way in which women had to fight opposition from churchmen every step of the way. Churchmen who felt that women were overstepping the proper bounds of Christian womanhood. And yet, it seems to me that these facts, while undisputed in the academy, are very much up to debate in the church. Missionaries still come home from teaching and preaching abroad, only to be told that they may not preach or teach men in their home congregation. And it continues to be the male mission leaders who are featured at length in our seminary textbooks, not the women who founded the first schools and hospitals for women in Asia and Africa. Which is more important? Which has had a more substantial impact on the world? I don't know the answer to that question, but at the very least, I think we need to start talking about it. And I think the church needs to do a better job of recounting the innovative nature of the women's missionary movement. Thank you.